Among the most important aspects of self-development is learning about financial matters and what to do with your hard-earned money, how to save for the future and for retirement, and how to properly invest. Regardless of your age and living situation, it is important to have a good deal of interest in financial matters, sufficient to guarantee that you will be able to navigate the economic downturns created by natural or artificial events. The better prepared we are, the most likely we are to survive any strong waves of economic downturns. In this video, we will explore a podcast contribution by a financial expert that is warning us about the next financial disaster waiting to happen. Without further ado, let's listen to Terry Hayes from Anointigator.com and his opinion provided on a podcast that we have transformed into video to help you understand better the economic challenge presented here. We hope you find it interesting and give us your comments and subscribe to receive notifications on future videos.
Governments around the world spend millions, even billions of dollars on plans to avoid economic slowdowns and problems. None of them were prepared for what came next. How could something so small that can't even be seen by the naked eye have the ability to stop the world economic system in its tracks? It seems stranger than fiction, but it's happening. Now, the good news is we're working through it and adapting. That's what humans do. We adapt and we move forward. That's the good news. But what comes next? How are the financial markets going to react? Are stocks going to crash? Will they stay down? If and when they rebound, how long will it take and will it last? And can the Federal Reserve bail us out once again? These are all good questions, and we will address these concerns one at a time in our upcoming podcasts. But here's the question and the concern we'll be addressing today. The Federal Reserve has lowered interest rates nearly to zero in hopes to stimulate the economy. That's good for now, but what future problems is this causing? Here's today's topic. Are bond mutual funds the next financial disaster waiting to happen? I know a lot of smart minds on Wall Street think so, and they're starting to prepare for it. But before I get deep into that question, let me ask you another question. When it comes to financial planning and asset allocation, have you heard of the Rule of 100? For many years, this widely used rule of thumb has been used by financial professionals and individuals to simplify asset allocation, or how your funds should be invested. It states that an investor should hold a percentage of stocks equal to 100 minus his or her age. For example, a 60-year-old would have 40% of their holdings in stocks. 100 minus 60 equals 40, therefore 40% in stocks. Yes, it's a simple and easy way for people to determine how conservative or aggressive they should be with their investments. Now, some may feel it's rather simplistic, but it's actually proved to be very accurate. Most people realize as you grow older and closer to retirement, you shouldn't be taking as much risk, because if a correction comes along like we've experienced recently, you won't have the time to let your assets rebuild before you start taking withdrawals. Now, this is just a quick guideline because every person listening here has a different situation, but it's a good place to start. For today's discussion, let's focus on the conservative portion, the 60%. Now, using the rule of 100, traditional financial planning says that 60% is to be invested in a safer or safe investment that produces interest for income. This is where retirees would get their additional income, which would be added to their Social Security and possibly a pension. This was a great plan and very easy to set up during the 1980s and 1990s. Many of you remember when CD rates were back up at 5 and 6% and bonds were paying 7 and 8%. The 60% of your account that was in safe money gave plenty of additional income, and maybe more important, it was protected from stock market exposure. The CDs would come due every 2 to 3 years, and the same with the bonds coming due every 5 to 10 years. You would receive your full principal back, and you would reinvest them at the new rates. But as we know, interest rates have been continually going down over the last 40 years. And when it came time to renew the CDs and bonds, many retirees realized that rates were quite a bit lower, maybe 4% on the CDs or 5 or 6% on the bonds. Therefore, the retirees counting on this money had to just accept lower amounts of interest and lower income. So what were the retirees to do? Well, where there's a demand, Wall Street will find something to meet that demand. Individual bonds and CD rates were lower, so Wall Street said, hey, if we pool them together in a mutual fund, we can also add some lower quality bonds or high yield bonds to get the interest rates back up. Plus, they could put in some longer maturity bonds like 25 or 30 years and hopefully increase interest rates. They also said, hey, this would make them overall safer because instead of owning 1 to 10 individual bonds in an account, you could own over 100 bonds inside the mutual fund, therefore being more diversified or protected if any bond was to default. Of course, this seemed logical and made sense. You would receive a higher income plus diversification. On the surface, a good thing for all, right? Instead of owning individual bonds with a single company like GE or Wisconsin Energy, you could own a mutual fund that had 100 or 200 different bonds. This makes very good sense for the most part and has worked out just as planned. But there's no free lunch. When you go into a bond fund, what do you give up? And this is key. You give up definition and maturity date, and I'll explain both. Definition is knowing exactly what you own, meaning if you bought an individual bond from a utility, let's say Wisconsin Energy, you knew that you owned a AAA rated bond from a utility and it had a certain length of maturity, say 10 years, and it paid a stated interest rate, say 5%. But in a mutual fund, there may be 100 different bonds that they manage, and they are constantly changing and replacing them at their discretion. Therefore, you don't know exactly what you own. You are trusting the mutual fund manager to make a good decision. The second thing you gave up is maturity date. Now, this may seem like no big deal, but it's a very important deal. Let me explain why. The value of bonds, just like stocks, move up and down every day. In fact, more money runs through the bond market on a daily basis than through the stock market. Let's say that you had put $10,000 into a bond that had a 10-year maturity, and let's say around year 5, the value of that bond had gone down to $8,500. If you sold it during that year, you would only get $8,500 because the value of the bond had decreased. But you also knew that if you held that bond to the maturity date for the 10 years, you would get the full value back of your bond, regardless of what the market was doing. At maturity date, bonds pay their full amount that was invested. So during those 10 years, you would have gotten your interest each year, and then at the end of the 10 years, you would have gotten your original $10,000 back at maturity. Makes sense, right? Well, with bond funds, that's not the case. There is no definition, or at least permanent definition. You don't know exactly what bonds you own. Now, you may be able to see what bonds they owned on the date of the last annual report, but they can be sold or exchanged for other bonds by the manager of the bond mutual fund at any time. And second, there is no maturity. No maturity date for a mutual fund. You know, the date when you would be made whole if there were any loss. Now, yes, there are 150 bonds inside the mutual fund that have maturity dates, but that is inconsequential to the bond fund holder. Now, why is this so important? Well, most of you know that I'm a math geek and I love crunching the numbers. So here's why it's so important, This is important because I believe it exposes the bondholders to possibly the next big disaster in the market. Now, I know this is a big claim, but it's important for you to at least know about. And I'm not the only one saying this. There are many PhD scholars and research analysts talking about this as well. So let me paint you a picture of why I think this is such a big deal. First of all, most people own bond funds because they are a safer investment or a way to reduce risk, plus get some income. Many of us probably remember or have heard stories when interest rates in the early 80s were at 15% on government bonds, and they have been coming down ever since over the last 40 years. In fact, today's 10-year Treasury is now at 0.9%. That's less than 1%. Imagine going from 15% to 0.9%. Pretty much lower every year, except for a few years that rates spiked and then started back down. I'm guessing that almost everyone here listening has either refinanced their mortgage on their home or knows somebody who has. And maybe you have refinanced 2 or 3 times. You see, lower interest rates have been a good thing. They've spurred economic growth, and they've helped bonds and bond fund returns over the last 40 years as interest rates have fallen. Okay, you're saying enough about that, but how does that affect bond funds now? Well, first of all, over the last 40 years, when interest rates have been falling, we know that has been a fantastic time for bonds and bond funds. You may remember I mentioned earlier that bond prices fluctuate every day, and the biggest factor in the pricing is what's going on with interest rates. Let me give you an example. If you buy a bond paying 10%, and interest rates go down to 8%, the value of your bond that was paying 10% will automatically be worth more, since people now could only get 8%. So they would be willing to pay you a premium for your bond. Say your $1,000 bond may now be worth $1,200. So as interest rates have been falling over the last 40 years, most bonds purchased with higher than current interest rates are worth more than when they were purchased. Now, there are some other factors, including quality of the underlying company and what the maturity date is. For this example, though, let's just look at interest rates. So as interest rates have fallen over the last 40 years, individual bonds and bond funds have been in a very good market, or what you would call a bull market. In most cases, their prices have always gone higher, and that's why bond funds, or the bond portion of most balanced portfolios, have shown to historically perform very good. But now what? Now here's the punchline, or the key takeaway from this podcast. If interest rates have been coming down for the last 40 years, and the current 10-year Treasury is less than 1%, and bonds or bond funds have been one of the best places to be for those 40 years, now what happens if interest rates stay the same, or in fact actually go up? Well, okay, let's look at both scenarios. First, just say they stay the same. Okay, with interest rates on treasuries at about 1%, and many bond funds paying 2 to 3%, that does not provide much additional income for retirees, or do much good as a counterbalance to any balanced portfolio. Now let's look and see what would happen if interest rates actually go up. This is what many feel could lead to the next financial problem or disaster for many unsuspecting people. Remember my example? If you had a 10% bond and the rate went to 8%, your bond would be worth more? Now think the exact opposite. We're in a place where interest rates are at 0.9%. And if they go to 2.9 or 3.9%, that's a big move in the bond market. What do you think would happen? What do you think would happen to most every bond mutual fund out there? They could easily lose 10 to 15% very quickly. And because there's no maturity date on bond funds, there's not much you can do to recoup those losses, especially if interest rates stay at the higher rates. So if interest rates are higher in the future than they are today, your bond fund will most likely be at a loss or lesser value. Sometimes a very small move up in interest rates can cause a dramatic loss in principal, especially if people feel that the interest rate cycle is about as low as it can go or may actually start to go up. Now, anyone listening to me today, you don't have to take my word for it. You can just Google, how do bond funds react when interest rates go up? I just Googled that, and an article came up that was published in Forbes, How Rising Interest Rates Are Driving Bond Funds Down, from April of 2018, which was a year that had interest rates going up just slightly. It says, and I quote, "When interest rates rise, bond prices fall." The inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices is the key to understanding what is happening to bond funds this year. Bonds, especially long-term bonds, are not a good place to invest when interest rates are rising. If interest rates continue to rise, as I expect, bonds could fall a lot further. The article went on to state that 73% of Morningstar's taxable bond funds and 90% of their municipal bond funds have lost money so far this year. Like I said, you don't have to take my word for it. You can check it out yourself. I am talking about this because many people turn to bond funds for principal protection and safety, and it may not work in a rising interest rate environment. Now, it's not good to be the bearer of bad news, but I want you to know about this so you can protect yourself. I put this out there to help each of you make an informed decision when it comes to safeguarding your money, especially your retirement money. Now, here's the key takeaway. When investing for principal protection and safety, look for definition, meaning you know exactly what you own. And look for a maturity date, meaning when does it come due or end? When is the walkaway date where I can get all of my money back that I put in?
Stay tuned for more upcoming videos from our channel, but allow us to provide you with some additional advice and disclaimers. We have received permission from Terry Hayes to use content from his website to create this video. It is intended to be used for general information purposes only and should not be construed as accounting, legal, tax recommendations, or specific investment advice. We reiterate, this is education only. The ideas and strategies expressed in this video should never be used without first assessing your own personal financial situation or without consulting a financial professional. Morrongo TV. Motivation, inspiration, fun.